You open your eyes in darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom with blackout curtains, but the kind of darkness that presses against your face like cold water. The air around you bites at your skin with a sharpness that feels wrong for the middle of summer. Inside your home, the temperature hovers somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no thermostat to adjust. There is no heater to turn on. This is simply how morning feels in the year 1347, and it will feel this way every morning for the rest of your life. Beneath you, the straw mattress offers nothing resembling comfort. Individual stalks poke through the rough fabric, leaving small welts on your back and sides where you've been lying for hours. The straw has compressed from months of use, forming hard lumps in some places and hollow depressions in others. You shift your weight, and the movement releases a faint smell of mildew and something earthier. The accumulated sweat and body oils of everyone who sleeps here. Because you don't sleep alone, not even close. To your left, your wife's breathing comes slow and steady. To your right, two of your children are curled against each other for warmth. At your feet, pressed into the remaining space, two more children share what little room exists. 6 people on a single sleeping platform, their body heat the only thing preventing genuine hypothermia during the night. Privacy is not a concept you understand, because privacy requires space, and space requires wealth you'll never possess. The single room of your home measures perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet. Everything happens here. Sleeping, eating, working during harsh weather, giving birth, dying. Against the far wall, separated by nothing more than a thin wicker partition, you can hear the cow shifting her weight. Her warmth actually helps. Some families bring their livestock fully inside during winter, letting the animals sleep among them, because a cow's body heat might mean the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Smoke hangs in the upper portion of the room, a permanent fog that never fully clears. The hearth in the corner burned through the night. It always burns. But without a proper chimney, the smoke simply rises and eventually finds its way out through gaps in the thatched roof. Your lungs adapted to this years ago. You don't cough anymore. The smoke smell has soaked into your hair, your clothes, your skin, so deeply that you no longer notice it. But it's there. Always there. Your body tells you it's time to move, not because you feel rested, but because lying still has become more uncomfortable than facing the cold. Your bladder has been signaling for the past hour, growing more insistent with each passing minute. There's a wooden chamber pot in the corner, shared by everyone, and it needs emptying. The rooster outside releases another crow, sharp and insistent, cutting through the pre-dawn silence. Somewhere in the village, other roosters answer. The day has begun whether you're ready or not. You push yourself upright, careful not to wake the children, though they'll need to wake soon anyway. The cold air hits your chest like a slap. You wore your clothes to bed. Everyone does, because undressing would mean freezing. The rough wool tunic you've worn for 3 straight weeks scratches against your skin as you move. It carries its own smell now, one you've long stopped noticing. Your feet touch the dirt floor, and the chill shoots up through your legs. This is morning in the dark ages. Not the beginning of possibility, but the start of another day of pure survival. No alarm clock to silence. No warm shower waiting. No coffee brewing in a kitchen that doesn't exist. Just cold, discomfort, and the basic animal need to empty your bladder before the day's endless labor begins. You think waking up is hard now. You haven't felt anything yet. The chamber pot sits in the corner where it always sits. A crude wooden bowl that's absorbed more than it should over the months. You can see its outline in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through gaps in the thatch. It's already half full from the night's use. 6 people, 1 pot, no alternatives. The smell reaches you before you reach it. A sharp ammoniac tang mixed with something earthier and more unpleasant. You've stopped noticing it the way you've stopped noticing smoke. But it's there. You squat over the pot, adding your contribution to the family's collective waste. There's no door to close, no separate room to retreat to, no lock to ensure a moment alone. Your wife stirs on the straw bed. One of the children coughs. This is normal. This is every morning. When you finish, there's nothing to wipe with except a handful of hay kept in a pile near the pot. In summer, you might use leaves. In cities, people save scraps of old cloth, using them until they disintegrate. The wealthy, those you'll never meet, supposedly use wool. You use hay, and you don't think much about it because you never have. Washing your hands requires water, and water is not something you waste on cleaning what will only get dirty again in an hour. The well sits at the center of the village. A 30-minute walk if you're not carrying anything heavy. That water is for drinking, for cooking, for the animals. Soap exists, but it costs money you don't have. It's made from animal fat and wood ash, harsh enough to crack skin, and reserved for the rare occasions when clothes need washing. Your hands stay as they are. Everyone's hands stay as they are. The chamber pot will be emptied later, probably by your wife or one of the older children. They'll carry it to the street and simply pour it out, the contents running down the sloped dirt road toward the lower part of the village. In cities, there are cesspits, deep holes in the ground where waste accumulates until someone deals with it. Those someones are called gong farmers, men who work only at night, shoveling human waste from pits so deep they sometimes suffocate from the fumes. They're paid well for their work. They have to be. No amount of washing removes the smell from their skin, their clothes, their very presence. They live in specific areas of cities, away from everyone else, marked by their profession as clearly as if they wore sign. Medieval cities carry a smell that would empty your stomach in minutes. Human waste in the streets, mixed with animal dung from horses and pigs and dogs, combined with rotting food scraps and the unwashed bodies of thousands packed into tight spaces. The smell is not an occasional assault, but a constant environment, a thick presence that residents breathe with every inhale. Visitors from the countryside often vomit upon entering city gates. City dwellers simply adapt, their sense of smell recalibrating to accept what cannot be changed. This is why disease spreads so easily. Fecal matter on hands that touch food. Water sources contaminated by waste seeping through soil. Flies moving freely between cesspits and dinner tables. The connection between cleanliness and health exists in some theoretical medical texts, but practical application requires resources that don't exist for common people. You need water to wash. You need soap to clean. You need knowledge that won't reach most of Europe for another 400 years. The chamber pot will be full again by tonight. Tomorrow morning, you'll squat over it again. This cycle doesn't end. It's not a problem to solve, but a reality to endure. And now, with that necessity handled, your body presents its next demand: hunger. The gnawing emptiness that's been your companion since yesterday's meager dinner now demands attention. Breakfast is not a given. It's not even expected. For most people living in 1347, the first meal of the day is actually the second meal, arriving sometime around midday when the sun sits high enough to mark the passage of morning into afternoon. Until then, your stomach will simply have to wait, complaining with a hollow ache you've learned to interpret as normal rather than urgent. Some mornings, you might drink water from the bucket near the door, though it tastes of the wooden container and whatever settled in it overnight. More often, you'll have a cup of ale, but not the ale you're imagining. This ale is thin, barely fermented, weaker than what modern people would consider beer. It exists because water alone can kill you, though you don't understand why. Something about the brewing process makes it safer to drink, even if the ale itself provides almost no nourishment and even less comfort. You sip it slowly, letting the liquid fill your stomach enough to quiet the worst of the hunger pangs. Then you wait. Work doesn't wait for you to feel ready. If you're fortunate, if the previous harvest was decent and your family managed to store enough, there might be bread. You pull a piece from the shelf where it's been sitting for 3 days, and the texture tells you everything about the distance between medieval food and modern expectations. This bread is dark, almost black, dense as a stone and nearly as hard. It's made from rye mixed with ground peas, some barley if the harvest allowed it. And during the worst times, ground tree bark that makes it even heavier in your gut. The crust could chip a tooth. In fact, you've watched it happen. Your neighbor lost 2 teeth last winter biting into bread that had frozen overnight. You dip the bread into whatever's left of yesterday's pottage, a thick stew that's been simmering over the hearth for so long you've lost count of the days. Each day, someone adds whatever can be spared. Turnips, onions if you have them, sometimes a handful of grain, water, to replace what's boiled away. The pot never fully empties. It just continues. A perpetual cycle of adding and consuming that defines your relationship with food. The bread softens slightly in the warm liquid, making it possible to chew without risking your remaining teeth. There is no salt on the table because salt costs more than you earn in a week. There is no sugar because sugar doesn't exist in your world, except as a rumor about what wealthy people in distant cities might taste. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, these are worth more than the cottage you're sitting in. A small bag of a black pepper could buy a cow. You will live your entire life without tasting anything beyond bitter, sour, and the bland earthiness of root vegetables and grain. The hunger never fully leaves. Even after eating, even on the rare days when there's enough, your body maintains a background hum of deficit. You're missing nutrients that don't have names yet, vitamins that won't be discovered for 600 years, minerals your bones are craving but will never receive in adequate amounts. This constant malnutrition slows your thinking, weakens your muscles, makes you susceptible to every sickness that passes through the village. A well-fed modern person could outwork you in any physical task, not because they're stronger by nature, but because their body has what it needs to function properly. Yours never has. The bread sits heavy in your stomach, a lump of sustenance that will carry you through the morning. It's not satisfying, it's not delicious, but it's there. And that alone makes today better than some days. Now, the real work begins. The sun owns you. not in a poetic sense, but in the most literal way imaginable. When it rises, you work. When it sets, you stop. There is no other choice because light itself is a luxury you cannot afford. A single tallow candle, made from rendered animal fat, costs roughly what you'd earn in a full day of labor. Beeswax candles cost even more, so far beyond your reach, they might as well be made of gold. These aren't items you purchase for convenience. They're reserved for emergencies, for the moments when someone is dying and needs last rites in darkness, or when a cow is birthing at night and you need to see whether you'll lose both mother and calf. So you rise with the sun because staying in bed past dawn means wasting the only free resource you have: daylight. In summer, this means waking at 4 in the morning when the first grey light begins to outline the world. You'll work for 14, sometimes 16 hours straight, racing against the descending sun to finish everything that needs finishing. Fields must be ploughed, crops tended, animals fed, repairs made, food prepared. The list never ends, and the sun doesn't wait for you to catch up. Winter offers a different kind of challenge. The sun rises late and sets early, giving you perhaps 8 hours of usable light. But the work doesn't decrease proportionally. Animals still need feeding. The hearth still needs constant attention. Ice must be broken on water sources. Repairs that couldn't wait must be done in the cold with numb fingers and fading light. You learn to prioritize ruthlessly, knowing that some tasks simply won't get done, and you'll pay for that failure when spring arrives. This creates a rhythm that modern people don't experience. Your life operates in seasonal extremes. Summer is frantic, exhausting, a desperate race to produce and preserve enough to survive the coming scarcity. You work until your hands bleed and your back screams and you can barely stand, because stopping early means starving later. Winter is semi-hibernation. You minimize movement to conserve calories. You sit in the cold and darkness, because lighting a fire all day requires firewood you might need more desperately in February. You sleep longer not because you're rested, but because sleeping burns fewer calories than being awake. The church bells mark your day in segments. Prime rings at sunrise, calling you to prayer, though most peasants can't actually attend. The fields won't wait. Terce comes mid-morning. Sext at noon signals a brief pause for food if there is any. None in mid-afternoon. Vespers as the light begins to fail. Complinus darkness takes over completely. You don't own a clock. No one you know owns a clock. Time isn't measured in hours and minutes, but in the position of the sun and the ringing of church bells that echo across the village. There is no weekend. The concept doesn't exist. Sunday is the Sabbath. Yes, a day of rest commanded by God and enforced by church law. But rest doesn't mean leisure. It means you don't work your Lord's fields. You still feed your animals. You still maintain your fire. You still prepare food. You still haul water. You still do everything necessary for survival. You just don't do the labor that benefits someone else. This is your rest. The same brutal work, but only for yourself. Cloudy days present a problem that modern people never consider. When thick clouds block the sun, the available light drops to levels that make detailed work impossible. You can't repair tools you can't see clearly. You can't mend clothes when the stitches disappear in shadow. You can't safely work with sharp implements when your depth perception vanishes. So productivity drops, Not because you're lazy or unmotivated, but because human eyes have limitations that artificial light solves, and you don't have artificial light. Everything, your productivity, your survival, your family's next meal, depends on the sun rising tomorrow and not hiding behind clouds. You have no control over this, no backup plan, no alternative. The sun commands and you obey, because in 1347 there is no other option. This dependence shapes everything about how you live, how you work, how you measure your days. And right now, the sun is up and strengthening, which means the real work begins. Your body is not yours to preserve. It's an instrument that must produce or you die, and instruments wear out with use. By the time you reach 30 years old, your hands will be deformed, your back will carry permanent damage, and your joints will ache with a persistence that never fades. This isn't exceptional. This is normal. This is what happens when survival requires destroying yourself one day at a time. Consider what plowing actually means. You're behind a heavy wooden plow, sometimes with an ox if you're fortunate, more often without because oxen cost more than most families will see in 5 years. The plow weighs as much as a full-grown man and fights you with every step. The blade catches on rocks, on roots, on the compressed earth itself. Your entire body strains against resistance that doesn't care about your strength or determination. Your shoulders take the brunt of it, your lower back compressing with each step, your knees absorbing impact as you stumble over uneven ground. You'll do this for hours, sometimes days, covering acres of land that must be turned before planting season ends. Harvesting grain requires a different kind of destruction. You bend at the waist, sickle in hand, cutting stalks close to the ground in a motion you'll repeat thousands of times today. Bend, cut, gather, stand, move forward. Bend, cut, gather, stand, move forward. By midday, your lower back is screaming. By afternoon, the pain has spread to your hips and up your spine. By evening, you can barely straighten. Tomorrow, you'll do it again. You'll do it until the harvest is complete or your body gives out, whichever comes first. Modern archaeologists examine medieval skeletons and see stories written in bone. Vertebrae compressed and fused from carrying heavy loads. Joint surfaces worn smooth and riddled with arthritis. Stress fractures that healed incorrectly. Bone spurs growing where muscles pulled too hard for too long. The remarkable thing isn't the damage itself, but the age of these skeletons. 30 years old. 35. 40 at the oldest. Bodies that show wear patterns doctors today associate with people in their 70s or 80s. Except these people never reached 70. They were used up decades earlier. There is no concept of light duty. No temporary leave for healing. No workers' compensation or disability benefits. If you're injured, you work through it because not working means not eating means dying. A twisted ankle that needs rest and elevation gets neither. You wrap it tightly and continue, and it never heals properly, leaving you with a permanent limp that makes every step painful for the rest of your shortened life. A strained back requires rest and treatment you'll never receive. It becomes chronic pain, a constant companion that worsens each year until lifting anything becomes agony. The blacksmith's lungs fill with metal dust and smoke, scarring tissue that can't be repaired. He'll develop a cough that never leaves, wheezing with every breath, drowning slowly in his own damaged lungs while he continues to work because his family needs eating. The miller breathes grain dust every day, fine particles that settle deep in his lungs and create inflammation that gradually chokes him. Washerwomen plunge their hands into water mixed with harsh lye soap, a caustic substance that strips away skin and leaves hands cracked and bleeding. The cracks don't heal, they just get deeper, becoming infected regularly. But the washing must continue. Shepherds walk 20 miles a day in all weather, every day for decades. Their knees deteriorate from constant impact. Their hips wear down. Their feet develop deformities from walking on uneven ground in inadequate shoes. By 40, walking the distances they covered effortlessly at 20 becomes torture, but the sheep still need tending, and there's no one to replace them. You see people you call old, and they're 42 years old. They're not genetically different from modern humans, too. They don't have weaker constitutions or inferior bodies. They're simply worn out. Decades of labor without rest, without proper nutrition, without medical care, without any of the recovery mechanisms that modern people take for granted. Their bodies have been used as tools until the tools broke, and broken tools don't get repaired in 1347. They just keep being used, less effectively, more painfully, until they stop working entirely. The strongest modern athlete, the most dedicated bodybuilder, the toughest endurance competitor, none of them could maintain the work pace of a medieval 12-year-old for more than a few days. Not because medieval children were superhuman, but because they had no choice except to continue until their bodies adapted or failed. Usually both. The sky decides whether you live or die, and you have no warning of its judgment. There is no weather forecast, no meteorologist explaining pressure systems and probability of precipitation, no app on your phone telling you to bring an umbrella. You wake up, look at the sky, and deal with whatever it brings. And you deal with it outside in the fields, because the work doesn't stop for rain or heat or snow or anything else. Nature decides to throw at you. When rain comes, you don't go inside. You keep working. The crops need tending regardless of weather. And delaying by even a day can mean the difference between adequate harvest and starvation. But you're not wearing modern rain gear. You're wearing wool, the same rough wool tunic you wear every day. And wool does something particularly miserable when it gets wet. It absorbs water like a sponge, becoming exponentially heavier with each passing minute. Soon you're carrying an extra 20 pounds of water-soaked fabric that clings to your skin and refuses to let go. The wetness doesn't end when the rain stops. You can't simply change into dry clothes because you don't have dry clothes. You own perhaps 2 outfits total, and both are now soaked. They need to air dry, a process that takes days in humid conditions or during cold seasons. So you stay wet, you work wet, you sleep wet. The dampness seeps into your skin, creating perfect conditions for fungal infections that will spread across your body in itching, burning patches. Your feet, enclosed in leather shoes that have holes and offer no waterproofing, develop rot between the toes. Respiratory infections follow, your lungs struggling against the constant cold and damp that never fully leaves your chest. Summer brings different torture. You're working under direct sun, wearing the only clothes you own, wool or linen that covers most of your body does, because exposed skin is considered immodest, and also because you need some protection from the sun's burning rays. But there is no sunscreen, no understanding of UV radiation or skin cancer. Just the immediate reality of heat building under heavy fabric while you labor in fields that offer no shade. There are no scheduled breaks to cool off, no cold water waiting in a cooler. If you're lucky, there's lukewarm water in a leather flask, tasting of the container and whatever grew in it last week. You drink it sparingly, because once it's gone, there's no more until you finish work and walk to the well. Winter work means handling metal tools with frozen hands. Your fingers go numb within minutes, losing sensation and dexterity. But the work continues. You're wearing leather shoes that have developed holes over months of use, or wooden clogs that offer minimal insulation against snow and frozen ground. Your feet hurt with the deep, bone-aching pain of constant cold. Frostbite is common. You've seen neighbors lose toes, the flesh turning black and eventually falling off. There's no medical intervention. You just deal with having fewer toes and continue working with whatever remains. Medieval people remember years by their weather. The year of the late frost that killed all the apple blossoms. The year of the summer drought when the well ran dry. The year of endless rain when grain rotted in the fields. These aren't just memories, they're trauma markers, because each weather event determined who lived and who died. A cold spring delays planting, which shortens growing season, which reduces harvest, which means less food for winter. A wet autumn makes harvesting impossible before the grain rots. A harsh winter kills livestock that were already weakened by inadequate feed. The cascading effects multiply in ways that trap entire regions. Drought kills crops. No crops means no food for your family and no feed for your ox. The ox starves or must be slaughtered, which means next spring you have no animal to pull the plough. Without a plough animal, you can't work as much land. Less land worked means even smaller harvest. Less harvest means more starvation, weaker bodies, higher death rates. One bad weather year creates problems that echo for 3 or 4 years afterward. You can't buy insurance against weather. You can't file a claim for crop loss. There's no government aid, no disaster relief, no emergency food supplies. There's only the sky, indifferent to your survival, and your body, forced to endure whatever conditions exist because stopping means dying. The weather doesn't care if you're comfortable. It doesn't care if you're equipped. It doesn't even care if you survive. And neither does anyone else. You are not free. You never were. You never will be. This isn't a moral judgment or a philosophical statement. It's a legal fact, encoded in the laws that govern every moment of your existence. You are a serf, and that word means something very specific. It means you don't own yourself. Your body, your time, your labor, your children's futures, none of it belongs to you. It all belongs to the Lord whose land you were born on, and the law says it will stay that way until you die. You cannot leave. The land you work is not yours, but you are bound to it as surely as if you were chained to a post. Leaving without your Lord's permission is a crime called fugitive serfdom. And the punishment for being caught ranges from public flogging to branding to having your feet mutilated so you can never run again. Some lords prefer cutting the Achilles tendon, less visible than amputation, but equally effective at keeping you in place. The message is clear. You were born here. You will work here. You will die here. Your labor is not your own to sell or withhold. 3 days each week, sometimes 4 or 5 depending on the season and your Lord's demands, you work his fields, not yours, his. You plow his land, plant his crops, maintain his buildings, repair his roads, harvest his grain. You do this for free, No wages, no compensation beyond the theoretical protection he offers and the small plot of land he permits you to work for yourself. That small plot, perhaps an acre if you're fortunate, must feed your entire family. But you can only work it after you've fulfilled your obligations to your Lord. During planting season, when every day matters, when timing means the difference between a harvest and hunger, you're working his fields instead of yours. The obligations extend beyond labor. When you die, your Lord takes your best animal as Heriot. Death tax paid in the form of the ox or cow your family desperately needs to survive. When your daughter marries, you pay marché, a fee for permission to let her leave the manor and join another household. The amount is arbitrary, determined entirely by your Lord's whim. If you can't pay, your daughter doesn't marry. When your Lord decides he needs extra money, he imposes tallage, a tax that has no limit and no justification beyond his desire for funds. You pay or face punishment. There is no appeal process, no one to complain to, no higher authority that cares whether the demands are reasonable. You cannot learn a trade without permission. Your son shows talent for carpentry or blacksmithing. Doesn't matter. Without your Lord's consent, he works the fields like you do. That consent rarely comes, because skilled tradesmen are less controllable than agricultural laborers, and control is what this system is designed to maintain. You cannot marry without permission, because marriage affects labor allocation, and your Lord has a vested interest in managing his workforce. You are not a person making life decisions. You are a resource being managed. Freedom, as modern people understand it, the ability to choose where you live, what work you do, who you marry, how you spend your time, is so far outside your reality that you don't even have words to express what you're missing. This isn't poverty in the modern sense, where economic hardship limits options, but options theoretically exist. This is legal bondage. You are owned, not technically as a slave, which would mean being property that could be bought and sold, but as something worse in some ways. A person who is legally defined as permanently inferior, bound by birth to a status that strips autonomy while maintaining just enough independence that you're responsible for your own survival. Your children will inherit this. Your son will work these same fields under the same obligations. Your daughter will need the same permission to marry. Your grandchildren will occupy the same legal status. The law has decided your family's permanent place in the social order, and there is no mechanism for changing it. You were born poor because the law required it. You will die poor for the same reason. Justice in 1347 is not about determining truth or rehabilitating offenders. It's about displaying power and instilling terror so complete that most people never dare to break rules in the first place. You have no right to a lawyer, because lawyers don't exist for people like you. You have no right to remain silent. No presumption of innocence, no appeals process. An accusation is often enough. If someone with authority believes you committed a crime, or simply wants to punish you, the outcome is already decided before any trial begins. The crimes that destroy lives seem trivial by modern standards. A starving man steals a loaf of bread to feed his children. His hand is cut off in the town square while a crowd watches. A peasant kills a rabbit in the forest. Not the Lord's fields, but the forest that's been declared noble hunting grounds. He's caught and blinded with hot irons, left to stumble through the world unable to work, unable to feed himself. A living warning to anyone who thinks wild animals belong to the hungry rather than the privileged. A woman speaks disrespectfully to a minor noble, her tone judged insufficiently deferential. She's stripped and whipped publicly, her back laid open in stripes that will scar permanently. When accusations are disputed, when someone claims innocence, trials take forms that reveal how differently medieval minds understood justice. Trial by ordeal places the accused's fate in God's hands through their body's reaction to torture. You're forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific number of paces. Your burned hands are then bandaged and sealed. 3 days later, the bandages are removed. If the burns show signs of healing, God has declared you innocent. If they're infected and festering, which they almost always are, God has judged you guilty. Or you're bound and thrown into blessed water. If you float, the pure water is rejecting you, proof of guilt. If you sink and drown, you are innocent. Congratulations! Your corpse gets Christian burial. These aren't considered cruel. They're considered sacred. God is the ultimate judge, and these ordeals allow him to reveal truth through physical signs. The fact that the system almost always produces guilty verdicts doesn't trouble anyone, because clearly most accused people are actually guilty. Why else would God show the signs he shows? Public executions are community gatherings. When someone is sentenced to death, the entire village or town is expected to attend. Children are brought specifically to witness what happens when social order is violated. These aren't quick deaths designed for efficiency. They're theatre, carefully orchestrated to maximize suffering and visibility. The breaking wheel involves tying someone to a large wagon wheel and systematically breaking their bones with iron bars. Legs first, then arms, then torso. While they remain conscious and screaming, the process can take hours. Drawing and quartering starts with hanging until nearly dead, then cutting down while still alive for disembowelment and dismemberment. Heretics burn at stakes in town squares, the smoke inhalation usually killing them before the flames do, if they're fortunate. But fortune is rare. The gibbet represents punishment that extends beyond death. It's a human-shaped cage made of iron bands, sized to hold a body. The condemned is placed inside, sometimes alive, sometimes already executed. And the gibbet is hung at a crossroads or prominent location. If alive, they die of exposure, thirst, and starvation over days while travelers pass below. Birds come to peck at exposed flesh. The body is left to rot in place, visible for months, until weather and scavengers reduce it to bones. The gibbet stays longer, a permanent reminder at that crossroads of what defiance costs. These displays are everywhere. Bodies hang at village entrances. Heads on pikes mark castle gates. Severed hands nailed to posts near marketplaces. You cannot go about daily life without encountering evidence or punishment. This is intentional. The message saturates your environment. Obey or suffer, comply or die, submit or face consequences so terrible that even thinking about resistance becomes unbearable. You live in a state of perpetual low-level terror. Not constant panic, but a background awareness that stepping out of line in any way could result in public torture and death. So you keep your head down, you work, you obey. You teach your children to do the same. Survival requires invisible compliance, with a system designed to extract everything from you, while giving nothing back except permission to continue existing under threat. Two people wake on the same morning in the same region under the same sky, but they might as well be living on different planets. The nobleman rises in a bed with linen sheets, soft from washing, covered with fur blankets that cost more than a peasant earns in 5 years. Servants have already lit fires in his chamber, warming the air to comfortable temperature. They bring heated water in a basin so he can wash his face and hands. He chooses what to wear from several outfits, each tailored specifically for him, made from fabrics you'll never touch. Velvet, silk, fine wool dyed in colors that cost fortunes. You wake on straw that hasn't been changed in months, in air cold enough to see your breath. Unwashed, because water must be carried and is needed for drinking. You wear the same rough wool tunic you've worn for 3 weeks straight. You own no other clothes suitable for work. The nobleman's hunting dogs sleep on better bedding than you do. They eat meat scraps from his table daily, more meat than your children will taste this entire season. The inequality isn't just visible, it's deliberately displayed. The castle rises above the village, stone walls announcing permanence and power. The nobleman rides through on horseback, an animal worth more than every possession your family has accumulated across generations. His procession includes servants, guards, carts, carrying goods for his household. Sometimes his horses trample through your field, destroying crops you desperately need. He doesn't stop, doesn't apologize, doesn't acknowledge the destruction, because to him, your crops matter less than his horse's convenient path. A single feast at the noble's table contains more food than you'll eat in a year. Roasted meats, beef, pork, venison, fowl, arrive on platters alongside white bread made from refined flour, cheese, fruit preserved in honey, wine imported from distant regions. The meal is theatre, a display of abundance that confirms status. Meanwhile, you're eating dark bread and turnips, the same meal you ate yesterday and will eat tomorrow, each bite calculated to provide just enough calories to work another day. The nobles don't see you as fully human, not in the way they're human. The church teaches that God created social hierarchy, that nobles are born to rule and peasants born to serve, and questioning this arrangement is questioning God's design. You are different in their eyes, a lesser category of being. Closer to the animals you tend than to the people who own you. Your pain matters less, your hunger is expected. Your death is inconvenient only if it happens during harvest season when your labor is particularly needed. When a noble rides through the village and accidentally kills a peasant child who didn't move from the road quickly enough, the penalty is a fine. Money paid to compensate for damaged property, because that's effectively what you are. Property that produces labor. But if you kill one of the noble's deer because your children are starving and you're desperate, you're executed publicly. The deer has more legal protection than your family does. The noble can hunt for sport, killing dozens of animals he won't eat, while you face death for taking one to prevent starvation. Some nobles claim droit de seigneur, the supposed right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night. Whether this was widely practiced or mostly threat is debated by historians. But the fact that it was discussed, that nobles felt entitled to even claim such rights, reveals the depth of the power imbalance. You exist for their benefit. Your body, your labor, your family, your dignity, all of it is secondary to their desires and convenience. The wealth gap isn't abstract. You see it every day. The castle on the hill, the noble's procession through the village, the abundance visible through castle windows during feast days while you're hungry. This inequality is built into the law, blessed by the church, enforced by violence, and inescapable. You will die poor. Your children will die poor. And everyone agrees this is exactly how God intended the world to function. The economy you read about in history books, feudal obligations, manor courts, official tithes and taxes, that was the surface. Beneath it, invisible to record keepers and largely ignored by authorities who knew better than to look too closely, existed the real economy that actually kept peasants alive. This shadow network operated on handshakes and trust, barter and mutual obligation, small acts of technically illegal trade that everyone engaged in because the legal system offered no path to survival, let alone prosperity. Your neighbor owns an ox. You don't. Buying an ox is impossible. The cost equals several years of your theoretical income, and you never have surplus income. So you make an arrangement. He plows your field with his ox in spring. You help him with harvest in autumn, bringing your family's labor when he needs many hands working quickly. Nothing is written down. No contracts exist. No taxes are paid on this exchange because officially it never happened. But it happens every year, and both families survive because of it. The woman 3 cottages down spins yarn with unusual skill, producing thread finer and stronger than most can manage. She trades it for things she needs: eggs from the family with many chickens, vegetables from those with better garden plots, help with repairs from someone whose husband is skilled with wood. Money rarely changes hands in these transactions. Money is scarce, controlled by those above you, easily taxed and tracked. But goods and labor can move between neighbors in ways that leave no official trace. Gleaning is technically legal. After your lord's harvest is complete, peasants are permitted to enter the fields and gather leftover grain, stalks the reapers missed, kernels that fell during collection. But the practice expands beyond its legal boundaries. You glean more than leftover scraps. You glean carefully, systematically, taking enough to matter while leaving enough that your theft isn't obvious. Everyone does this. The unspoken rule is taking enough to survive, while not taking so much that authorities feel compelled to punish someone as an example. The forest is forbidden territory. Hunting is the exclusive privilege of nobility. But rabbits don't respect legal boundaries, and starving families don't respect laws that prioritize noble sport over children's survival. You set snares at night in areas you know from childhood, checking them before dawn, taking what you catch and erasing evidence of your presence. If questioned, you found a dead rabbit. You didn't kill it. You don't know how it died. Everyone tells the same story because everyone is doing the same thing. Small-scale production happens in homes where authorities rarely venture. You brew ale without the required license because your family needs something safer than water to drink, and ale to sell brings income that keeps you from complete destitution. Your wife makes simple remedies, herbal preparations that ease pain or reduce fever, and trades them within the village network. These activities technically require permissions and trigger tax obligations. But enforcing such rules on every household would require surveillance that doesn't exist and would likely trigger the kind of desperation that leads to actual rebellion. The village operates on collective silence when authorities ask uncomfortable questions. Someone is accused of poaching. Where were they that night? Everyone saw them in the village. They couldn't have been in the forest. It's impossible. The story holds because everyone knows their turn for protection will come eventually. When tax collectors arrive demanding information about household production or hidden goods, memory becomes remarkably unreliable. Goods disappear into hidden spaces prepared specifically for such occasions. False floors, concealed cellars, hollows in walls that authorities would need to demolish homes to discover. This isn't dramatic resistance. There are no revolutionary manifestos or organized movements. It's survival resistance, daily and continuous. Millions of small acts of circumventing a system designed to extract everything from you. The system knows it happens. The authorities aren't stupid. But they also know that enforcing every rule to its fullest extent would mean starving the workforce to death. And dead peasants produce nothing. So an unofficial compromise exists. Peasants engage in low-level illegal activity to survive. Authorities mostly pretend not to notice, and life continues in this strange balance between law and necessity. You will live your entire life within 10 miles of where you were born. You will see the same faces every day from childhood until death. This isn't a charming small-town story. It's a survival mechanism. The people around you aren't just neighbors. They're your insurance policy, your safety net, your only protection against disasters that will inevitably come. And you are theirs. Everyone knows everything about everyone. Privacy doesn't exist because privacy is a luxury that requires resources to maintain. Separate homes with thick walls. Financial independence that allows you to survive without community support. Legal systems that protect individual rights. You have none of these. When your wife gives birth, the village knows. When you argue with your husband, the village knows. When you're running low on food before harvest, the village knows. This knowledge isn't gossip for entertainment. It's information tracking who needs help and who can provide it. When storms collapse your roof in the middle of winter, you don't hire contractors or file insurance claims. The next morning, men from surrounding families arrive with tools and materials. They spend the day rebuilding what was destroyed. You don't pay them. Payment isn't expected because payment would be impossible. Instead, you remember. When one of them needs help, and they will, you provide your labor in return. The accounting is informal, tracked in memory, and social obligation rather than contracts and ledgers. A father dies during plowing season, leaving a widow and young children who cannot work his fields alone. The widow doesn't lose everything, doesn't face immediate starvation, because neighboring men include her fields in their plowing rounds. They plant her crops, they help with harvest. Not from pure altruism, but from the knowledge that families broken by disaster weaken the entire village. Her children, as they grow, will provide labor to the community. Her survival is an investment in collective future capacity. When a woman goes into labor, other women take over her work obligations. They tend her garden, prepare her family's food, watch her other children, maintain her household while she recovers. This continues for days, sometimes weeks, depending on complications and recovery. The laboring woman doesn't thank them with gifts or payment. She provides the same service when they need it. The rotation of support is automatic, expected, essential. Crop failure hits some families harder than others. Variation in soil quality, slight differences in planting timing, luck, these create uneven outcomes even in the same village. Families with surplus share with families facing shortage, not from generosity, but from calculated self-interest. Next year, your harvest might fail. The family you help today remembers. The family you refuse to help also remembers. And when your turn for disaster comes, and everyone's turn comes, their memory determines whether you survive. Children belong partially to the community. Any adult can discipline any child. If your son misbehaves in a neighbor's field, that neighbor corrects him immediately. If your daughter shows disrespect, any village elder can reprimand her. This isn't seen as intrusion, it's collective responsibility for raising the next generation properly. Those children will eventually be the workers, the decision makers, the supporters. Everyone has a stake in how they develop. Major life events involve the entire village because they affect community capacity. A wedding means reorganizing labor allocation and potentially creating new households. A death means losing a worker and redistributing their obligations. A birth means future labor potential, but immediate resource drain. These aren't just family matters, they're collective concerns requiring group adjustment. Individualism as modern people understand it doesn't exist. You cannot pursue personal success at community expense. You cannot isolate yourself and still survive. The village is your extended family, providing support you desperately need while demanding conformity and transparency you cannot escape. Your survival depends on your neighbors liking you enough to help when disaster strikes. And disaster always strikes eventually. The calendar offers more breaks than you might expect. Not because medieval life is easy, but because the church has declared dozens of holy days throughout the year, feast days for saints, religious observances, festivals that mark the turning of seasons. On these days, work is prohibited or significantly reduced. And when work stops, something remarkable happens. People remember they're human. These aren't quiet, reverent observances. They're explosions of energy that's been compressed by months of grinding labor. Ale flows freely, brewed specially for the occasion or saved from household stores. People who normally eat turnips and dark bread suddenly have access to better food. Not wealthy food, but perhaps meat from a communal pig slaughter. White bread made for the occasion. Cheese that's been aging for this specific celebration. The feasting lasts hours, accompanied by singing that grows louder and less coherent as the ale takes effect. Dancing happens in the village common area. Not formal, choreographed performances, but communal movement to simple rhythms. Musicians play pipes and drums, sometimes a fiddle if the village has someone with the skill. People dance until they're exhausted, releasing energy and emotion that has no outlet during normal working life. Young people use these occasions for flirtation, brief moments of connection under the watchful eyes of the entire community, but with slightly more freedom than daily life allows. Some festivals deliberately invert normal order. The Feast of Fools turns hierarchy upside down for a day. Peasants dress in mock noble clothing, ridiculous imitations made from scraps and imagination. A villager is crowned mock king, given exaggerated authority that everyone treats with theatrical seriousness before dissolving into laughter. Men dress as women. Authority figures are mocked openly. Songs and performances ridiculing nobles and even clergy. Commentary that would result in punishment on any normal day. But it's not only permitted, but expected during these sanctioned releases of pressure. The authorities understand what's happening. These festivals function as safety valves. People living under constant oppression, denied autonomy and dignity, will eventually rebel unless given periodic outlets for their frustration. Better to allow controlled chaos one day a year than face uncontrolled rebellion. So the church and nobility permit these inversions, these moments of mockery and release, because the alternative is worse for everyone. Between major festivals, smaller entertainments fill occasional leisure time. Men wrestle in informal competitions, testing strength that's developed through labor rather than training. Foot races happen, young men sprinting between landmarks for bragging rights and the attention of watching young women. Primitive ball games emerge, rules varying by region and often by match, more about physical activity and competition than structured sport. Archery practice serves dual purposes, maintaining skills useful for hunting and warfare while providing competitive entertainment. Music and song permeate daily life in ways modern people rarely experience. Work songs make repetitive labor more bearable, creating rhythm that coordinates group effort while providing distraction from discomfort. Ballads tell stories, preserving history and legend through oral tradition, because most people can't read written accounts. Religious hymns provide emotional release, communal identity, connection to something larger than individual suffering. People sing while working, while walking, while sitting around fires after dark. Song costs nothing and provides comfort that material possessions cannot. Romance exists even in poverty. Young people find moments to meet, brief conversations while fetching water or working nearby fields. Flirtations develop under heavy community supervision, but attraction and affection aren't luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Marriages are economic arrangements, negotiated between families for practical benefit, but they can still develop genuine affection. Couples who marry for convenience sometimes discover partnership, companionship, even love, amid the shared struggle of survival. Medieval people work harder than most modern people can imagine. They own almost nothing. They live under constant threat and deprivation. But they also sing, dance, celebrate, laugh, love, and find joy in moments stolen from hardship. They're not just surviving. They're living, maintaining their humanity against systems designed to reduce them to labor units. The desire for happiness transcends material conditions. Joy finds cracks to grow through even in the hardest soil. And that persistence, that refusal to be only suffering, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval survival. The spiritual world is not something you believe in. It's not faith in the modern sense, where you choose to accept or reject religious claims based on personal conviction. It's fact, as real as the ground beneath your feet, as undeniable as hunger, as immediate as the cold air you breathe each morning. Heaven exists above. Hell exists below. Angels and demons move through the world, invisible but present, influencing events and human souls. God watches constantly, recording every action, every word, every thought. This isn't religious enthusiasm. It's your fundamental understanding of how reality operates. The church controls time itself. The calendar you live by is organized entirely around religious observations. Every day is defined by its relationship to saints and holy events. The week exists because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The hours of each day are marked by church bells calling to prayer, matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in afternoon, vespers as evening approaches, compline before sleep. These bells aren't suggestions. They're the rhythm of existence, the audible structure of time that everyone follows, because there is no alternative measurement. You cannot read. Almost no one you know can read. The priests can read. The monks in distant monasteries can read. The nobility can sometimes read. But you cannot, which means your understanding of everything, history, geography, law, morality, the nature of the cosmos, comes entirely through church teaching. The priest tells you about the world, and you have no way to verify or challenge what he says. He is your only source of information beyond what you can directly observe in your immediate surroundings. When he describes hell's torments or explains why plague has come to punish sin, you have no competing framework for understanding these events. Salvation anxiety is not occasional worry. It's a constant presence, a psychological weight that never lifts. You might die today, right now. Accident, disease, violence, death gives no warnings. And if you die in a state of sin, if you have unconfessed wrongdoing on your soul, you will burn. Not metaphorically, literally burn, in actual flames, in unbearable agony, forever, not for a long time, forever. The concept of eternity is hammered into your consciousness from childhood. Whatever suffering you experience in this life, no matter how terrible, is nothing compared to infinite suffering after death. The sermons make sure you understand. Priests describe hell in graphic detail. The specific tortures awaiting specific sins. The demons with tools designed for maximum pain. The complete absence of hope or mercy. The church walls might display paintings of the Last Judgment, showing souls being dragged by demons into flames while others ascend to heaven. You see these images every time you attend Mass, which is frequently. The message is clear and constantly reinforced. Your eternal fate depends on your behavior, and the standards are strict, and death could come at any moment. This fear is deliberately cultivated. The Church knows that people controlled by terror of eternal damnation are compliant, obedient, willing to accept earthly hardship because it's temporary, compared to infinite punishment. You tolerate your miserable existence partly because the alternative, rebelling against the social order that church doctrine says God established, risks far worse suffering after death. Better to endure a few decades of poverty and oppression than eternity in flames. But the church also offers escape. Confession allows you to admit sins and receive forgiveness. Penance, specific prayers or acts assigned by the priest, provides a path to clearing your slate. The sacraments, baptism, communion, last rites, are supernatural transactions that affect your soul's status. Indulgences, which you can obtain through various means, including payment, reduce your time in purgatory, that intermediate space where sins are burned away before entering heaven. The Church has created both the problem and the solution, both the terror and the comfort. You don't question this system, not because you're stupid or blindly obedient, but because you have no framework for questioning it. The supernatural is real. Sin has consequences. The Church has authority over spiritual matters, just as surely as your Lord has authority over temporal matters. Both hierarchies are established by God, according to everyone with knowledge and power. Your task is not to understand or critique, but to obey, confess, perform required rituals, and hope that when death comes, today, tomorrow, next year, your soul is in sufficient grace to avoid eternal torture. This is normal. This is simply how reality works in 1347. The Church demands 1/10 of everything you produce, not 1/10 of your surplus, not 1/10 of what you can afford, 1/10 of everything. You harvest 30 bushels of grain. 3 go to the church. You own 10 chickens. 1 belongs to God, which means it belongs to the church that represents God. The eggs those chickens produce, the vegetables from your garden, the labor of your hands, all of it is subject to the tithe, a tax on your existence that you pay before you feed your family. This isn't optional. It's law, enforced by both secular and religious authority. Refusing to tithe brings excommunication, which isn't just being banned from church services. It's being cut off from all sacraments, which means any sin you die with becomes permanent. It means being socially dead. Because no one will associate with an excommunicated person for fear of sharing their curse. It means eternal damnation if you die before the excommunication is lifted. So you pay. You watch your children go hungry, and you pay. Because the alternative is worse than hunger. The tithe is only the beginning. Every major life event costs money you don't have. Your baby needs baptism within days of birth, before the original sin they're born with can condemn them if death comes early. The baptism costs a fee. Your daughter wants to marry. The marriage must be performed and blessed by the church, or it's not valid, and invalid marriages are sinful. Another fee. Your father dies. He needs burial in consecrated ground, or his soul will wander, unable to reach heaven. The burial costs more than your family has saved in months. You find the money because refusing means abandoning your father's soul to eternal suffering. Confession requires payment. Absolution requires payment. Having prayers said for dead relatives suffering in purgatory requires payment. The Church has inserted itself into every spiritual transaction necessary for salvation and attached a price to each one. These aren't small symbolic contributions. They're substantial portions of your meager income, demanded during times when you're least able to pay. When a family member has just died, when a daughter is marrying and leaving the household, when a baby's survival is uncertain, then there are indulgences. The Church teaches that sin must be punished, if not in life, then in purgatory, where souls burn away their remaining sins before entering heaven. But you can reduce that time for yourself or for dead relatives already suffering by paying money. The Church is literally selling reduced sentences for sin. You are told that your dead mother is in flames, suffering, and you could shorten her agony by giving money you don't have. The psychological trap is elegant and vicious. You're already poor. Your family is already hungry. But how can you refuse when your mother's torture could be lessened? The village priest is often trapped between two worlds. He's barely better educated than his parishioners, frequently from the same peasant background, sometimes barely literate himself. Church hierarchy demands he collect these fees, enforce tithing, sell indulgences, generate revenue that flows upward to bishops and abbots and eventually Rome. He watches his community suffer. He knows the family with the dying child can't afford the baptism fee. He knows the widow can't pay for her husband's proper burial. Some priests show mercy, accepting smaller payments, or performing services regardless of payment. These men are rare and remembered gratefully. More common are priests who enforce the rules strictly, who live noticeably better than their parishioners, whose houses have better food and warmer fires, while they preach about the virtues of poverty and accepting God's will. The church teaches that rich men can barely enter heaven, that wealth is spiritual danger, that poverty is blessed. But those teachings come from an institution that has accumulated staggering wealth by extracting it from the poorest people. The monasteries own vast lands. The bishops live in palaces. The church hierarchy dresses in fine robes and eats elaborate meals, while explaining that suffering brings you closer to God. The contradiction is visible, undeniable, and rarely acknowledged. You pay because you must. You tithe because the law requires it, and damnation awaits refusal. You pay for baptisms, marriages, burials, confessions, prayers, indulgences, all while hungry, all while watching your family struggle, all while being told that your poverty is virtuous and your suffering is preparation for heaven. The church offers salvation. The price is everything you have. Your child is sick. Fever burns through her small body, turning her skin hot and dry. She's been declining for 3 days, barely eating, crying weakly when she has energy to cry at all. You don't know what's wrong because illness isn't understood through mechanisms like bacteria or viruses. Disease comes from God's punishment for sin or demonic possession, or imbalances in the body's 4 humors, or the malign influence of planets in unfortunate alignment. The cause doesn't matter as much as finding a cure, and the cures available are prayer, pilgrimage, and medical practices that often kill faster than the disease would. You pray, not casual prayer, but desperate, pleading prayer to specific saints known for specific ailments. Your daughter has a fever, so you pray to Saint Sebastian, who protects against plague and infectious disease. If she had eye problems, you'd pray to Saint Lucy, who was blinded for her faith. Toothaches require Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth pulled out during martyrdom. The logic connects suffering saints to the suffering they endured, creating a catalogue of specialized intercessors between humans and God's healing power. When prayer at home fails, pilgrimage becomes necessary. There's a church 2 days' walk from here that houses a relic, a fragment of bone from a saint, they claim. Sick people who touch the relic are sometimes healed. Sometimes. The journey requires carrying your fevered child for miles, exposing her to weather and exhaustion while she's already weak. But earthly medicine has nothing better to offer, and watching her die without trying something is unbearable. So you go, joining other desperate families at the church, waiting your turn to approach the relic, hoping for the miracle that might come. The village has someone who practices medicine, though the word is generous for what he does. He believes in the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and thinks disease comes from these fluids being out of balance. Your daughter has too much blood, he announces after looking at her flushed face. The cure is bloodletting. He cuts her arm with a blade that's been used on previous patients without washing. Your sick child, already weakened by days of fever, loses blood she can't afford to lose. The medical theory says this helps. The reality is it makes her weaker. Some treatments seem designed by people who learnt medicine from torture manuals. Trepanning involves drilling a hole in someone's skull to release the evil spirits causing their headaches or madness. The procedure is done with the patient fully conscious, held down by strong men while a drill bores through bone. Many die from the procedure itself. Those who survive often develop infections that kill them days later. Cauterization burns wounds closed with red-hot irons, creating new pain and damage to supposedly heal existing injury. The screaming can be heard throughout the village. Medicine often consists of substances that couldn't possibly help. Ground precious stones mixed into paste and eaten. Animal dung applied to wounds. Human body parts from executed criminals, the fresher the better, used in various preparations because they supposedly carry special properties. These aren't fringe practices of village healers. These are recorded in medical texts written by the most educated physicians of the time. Surgery exists but only for the desperate. There's no anesthesia beyond alcohol or occasionally opium, which costs more than most people earn in a year. Operations happen with the patient fully conscious, feeling everything, screaming and struggling while held down. Amputations are done with saws. Abdominal surgeries are performed with no understanding of sterilization or infection control. Dental extractions often result in massive infections as bacteria from the extraction site spreads to the jaw and eventually the brain. Most surgical patients die either during the procedure from shock and blood loss or days later from infections that have no treatment. Common conditions that modern medicine treats easily become death sentences. A broken bone that sets incorrectly leaves you permanently disabled. Appendicitis causes death by rupture and peritonitis. Dental abscesses spread infection through your face and skull. Childbirth kills constantly through hemorrhaging or infections or complications no one knows how to address. You watch your neighbors die from preventable conditions. You watch children suffer through illnesses that require only antibiotics or simple interventions that won't be discovered for centuries. When your child dies, despite the prayers, the pilgrimage, the bloodletting, the remedies, you're left with grief and a bill. The church charged for the prayers. The relic required a donation. The failed medicine still costs money. Your child is gone, and you're poorer for having tried to save her. You will go months without washing your entire body, sometimes years. This isn't neglect or laziness. It's a rational calculation based on resources that don't exist and labor you can't spare. Water doesn't come from a tap. It comes from a well in the village center, a 30-minute walk each direction, carried in heavy buckets that leave your shoulders aching. That water is for drinking, for cooking, for animals. Using it to wash your body is waste you cannot afford. Even if you had water, heating enough for bathing requires firewood that's needed for more essential purposes. Your hearth fire cooks your food and provides the only warmth in winter. Gathering enough wood to heat several gallons of water to comfortable temperature means hours of labor collecting and carrying fuel. Those hours could be spent on work that keeps you alive. The choice isn't difficult. You stay dirty, your body carries months of accumulated grime. Sweat from labor has dried and layered, creating a film on your skin that never fully disappears. Smoke from the constant hearth fire has permeated your hair and skin so thoroughly that you don't notice it anymore, though the smell is there, clinging, permanent. Dirt from fields has worked its way into your skin, ground in by the nature of agricultural work, crawling through mud, harvesting crops, handling earth with bare hands. Your fingernails are black underneath, packed with dirt that's been there so long it's become part of you. The smell is difficult for modern people to imagine. It's sweat, yes, but not the sharp scent of fresh perspiration. It's old sweat, layered and fermented, mixed with smoke and dirt and the wool clothing worn directly against your skin without any barrier. That wool is never washed either, absorbing your body's oils and excretions for months, becoming stiff in places and maintaining odors that would clear a modern room in seconds. But you don't smell it. Not really. Everyone smells the same way. The entire olfactory environment is saturated with strong scents. Manure from animals, human waste in streets, rotting food, unwashed bodies. Your personal smell doesn't stand out because it's just part of the general atmosphere. When bathing does happen, it's not the private warm shower you're imagining. In summer, people might swim in rivers or streams, more to cool off than to actually clean. In cities with bathhouses, which are rare and require payment most can't afford, bathing is communal. Multiple people share the same water in large wooden tubs. You're not getting clean so much as getting wet alongside others, all contributing their dirt to the same increasingly murky water. Medical teachings actively discourage bathing. Physicians, the educated men who study the body and disease, teach that water opens the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. The layer of dirt and oil on your skin is considered protective, a barrier against the evil influences that cause illness. Washing it away leaves you vulnerable. This isn't ignorance taking a wallowing. This is the best medical knowledge of your time, taught by the most educated people available. You're staying dirty partly because you believe it keeps you safer. Even nobility don't bathe frequently. A king might bathe a few times per year, and when he does, it's an elaborate production. Servants haul and heat water. The tub is prepared. Attendance is required. It's less about hygiene than ritual. Queens and nobles follow similar patterns. They smell better than peasants because they can change clothes more often and use perfumes to mask odors. But they're not clean by modern standards. Not even close. Your body itches constantly. The combination of accumulated sweat, embedded dirt, and unwashed clothing creates persistent discomfort that you've learned to ignore because there's no alternative. Your skin develops rashes that come and go. Minor infections appear and heal or don't heal. You're uncomfortable in your own skin every moment of every day. And this is just normal. This is what bodies feel like. You've never known anything different, and you never will. The shirt on your back right now has probably been washed more times than a medieval peasant's clothes were washed in their entire life. In a world without plumbing, soap factories, or cheap cloth, laundry was not a chore. It was an ordeal, one that few could afford to face often. Most people owned only two sets of clothing, the one on their body and another waiting to be mended. When one fell apart beyond saving, it were patched, cut down, or turned into rags until even those scraps were gone. To wash anything at all required a kind of determination that bordered on heroism. Water had to be fetched by hand, carried in buckets from rivers or wells. Heating it was out of the question. Firewood was precious, and every log burned for laundry meant one less for warmth or cooking. So the water was cold, often muddy, and clothes were soaked until the dirt softened enough to scrub away. The soap, if it could be called that, was made from lye and animal fat, a caustic mixture that burned skin and shredded cloth. Hands cracked and bled from the labor, but the dirt clung stubbornly. It took hours of pounding, rubbing, and rinsing before the garments were remotely clean, and even then they smelled of smoke, sweat, and ash. Once washed, clothes had to dry. In damp climates, that could take days. While they hung stiffly in the wind, the washer had nothing else to wear. For many, this meant staying half-dressed in the cold or wrapping in a blanket by the fire, waiting for the fabric to stop dripping. The task was so destructive to cloth that it could halve its lifespan. Every washing was a small act of sacrifice, wearing the fabric thinner, hastening the day it would need patching again. Most peasants wore a simple linen shift closest to the skin, a coarse, unbleached layer meant to protect the outer garments from sweat. But without regular washing, the shift absorbed everything: oil, dirt, dead skin, the faint residue of smoke and labor. Over it came wool tunics or dresses, thick and itchy, heavy when damp, impossible to dry fully in winter. Every fiber held the scent of the body that wore it. It was said that even the wind could tell the poor apart by smell alone. Colors, too, faded into sameness. What might have once been dyed with plant pigments, browns, greens, dull reds, inevitably turned to a common greyish tone, the universal hue of long wear and deeper grime. Stains from earth, sweat, and food became permanent maps of labor. Elbows and knees were patched so many times the garments became a mosaic of different cloths, none of them matching. The poorest wore clothes that had outlived multiple owners. Garments inherited, traded, or gifted, still holding the faint shape and sweat of those who came before. Clothing was so valuable it appeared in wills handed down like heirlooms. A tunic might serve a man, his son, and his grandson before finally being cut into scraps for polishing metal or binding wounds. And through it all, the clothes lived. Not metaphorically, but literally. Lice and fleas nested in seams and folds, feeding as easily from wool as from skin. The heat of the body kept them alive. The grime gave them shelter. Even washing couldn't guarantee their removal. They clung to thread and cloth, surviving cold water and returning to bite again the next night. It was impossible to be free of them. The very garments meant to protect you were also your captors, holding the creatures that fed on your blood. From morning until night, people moved in discomfort. The itch of wool, the sting of sweat-soaked seams, the endless crawling beneath their clothes. To be dressed was to be burdened, yet to be naked was unthinkable. Between these two miseries, medieval life unfolded, scratch by scratch, stitch by stitch. And under those same seams and layers, something else was waiting. The dirt and warmth of unwashed clothing made perfect homes for the true rulers of the medieval body, the parasites that lived not just on the garments, but in the flesh beneath. They didn't wonder if they had lice. They wondered how many they had today, and whether they'd have time to pick them out before nightfall. In the medieval world, parasites weren't a mark of shame or neglect. They were a fact of life, as common as hunger or rain. Everyone, from the humblest peasant to the most perfumed noble, shared their body with tiny creatures feeding on their blood and skin. Delousing was a familiar ritual, part of the rhythm of daily life. Families, lovers, and friends would sit together by the hearth, fingers parting hair, searching patiently for the pale bodies of lice. The small popping sound when one was crushed was unremarkable, even satisfying. Conversation flowed easily while it happened. Discussions of crops, gossip, prayers. It was not something to hide, because everyone itched and everyone scratched. There were three kinds of lice that ruled the medieval body: head lice, body lice, and pubic lice. Head lice lived where warmth and hair gave shelter, creeping through scalps like restless ghosts. Body lice hid in the seams of clothes, moving onto skin to feed and returning to the fabric to lay their eggs. Pubic lice preferred coarser hair, spreading through contact that few spoke of openly. Each variety had its own small kingdom of discomfort, and each demanded endless attention. A person might boil their clothing, shave their hair, or smear oils and ashes into their scalp to drive them out. But the victory never lasted long. The moment clean cloth touched infested skin again, the invasion began anew. Fleas were worse still, small, agile, everywhere. They lived not just on people, but in the straw of mattresses, the folds of blankets, the cracks of wooden floors. Their bites formed dark constellations on every limb, red and maddening. The constant itching meant constant scratching, and scratched skin meant open wounds. In a world without soap or antiseptics, even a simple bite could fester, becoming a small, slow misery that no one could escape. Dogs, cats, and livestock carried their own swarms, each one a bridge for infection. When night came, the fleas feasted most freely, and the sound of restless bodies shifting on straw was as common as the whisper of wind against the shutters. Inside the body, other passengers waited. Intestinal worms were nearly universal. People sometimes saw them emerge after meals, thin and pale against the darkness of waste. They drained strength invisibly, leaving their hosts gaunt and weak. The cures were desperate and brutal, purging with bitter herbs, swallowing substances that forced violent diarrhea in hopes of flushing the invaders out. It might work for a while, but with every mouthful of contaminated food, every sip of water drawn from a stagnant well, the cycle began again. Then there were the burrowers, scabies mites tunneling beneath the skin, causing unbearable itching. Bedbugs that fed silently in the night. Ticks clinging after days spent in the fields. Botfly larvae that nestled beneath flesh. To be alive was to host a kingdom of creatures, unseen yet always felt. It wasn't a failure of cleanliness. It was nature's intimacy at its most relentless. Even the nobility could not escape. Their linens were finer, their baths more frequent, but lice still hid beneath the embroidery of gowns and the curls of perfumed wigs. Some elaborate hairstyles were designed not for beauty alone, but to conceal the marks of infestation. The most powerful men in Europe might have commanded armies, yet they could not command their own skin to be free of parasites. Parasites shaped history in ways few realized. Fleas carried the bacteria that would bring the Black Death. Body lice spread typhus through the close-packed ranks of soldiers and prisoners. Worms, ticks, and flies passed invisible sicknesses through food and blood. The medieval body was an open door. No defenses, no real control. To live, then, was to share your own body with countless others, unseen and insistent. You were never alone, even in sleep. And this constant closeness, the crawling, the bites, the sickness, prepared the ground for something far greater. The world of parasites was also the world of plagues, where the smallest creatures decided the fate of empires. One morning your neighbor is healthy. 3 days later, their body lies in a pit with 50 others, and you're wondering if you touched something they touched. That was how swiftly death moved when plague arrived. It came without warning, without logic, without mercy. At first, there were whispers, rumors carried along muddy roads, traders muttering of strange sickness in the next town. Stories of sudden fevers, of people dropping dead in the streets. Refugees appeared at the gates, desperate, hollow-eyed, fleeing places that no longer existed. They brought with them their possessions, their fear, and though no one yet understood it, the fleas that carried death itself. Then came the first local case. Perhaps a farmer, strong and sunburned, who one morning could no longer rise from his bed. His groin or armpits would swell into hard lumps, painful to the touch, growing until they were the size of eggs. The fever followed, raging, unrelenting, twisting the mind into delirium. The victim's skin darkened, first around the swellings, then spreading in irregular blotches until entire limbs turned black. Within 3 to 5 days, the person was gone. Sometimes the swellings burst before death, releasing a foul-smelling discharge that horrified everyone who witnessed it. No one knew how it spread. Some believed it was carried on the air, others that it was punishment for sin. There was no concept of bacteria or fleas, no understanding of contagion. Families nursed their loved ones with bare hands, holding them as they coughed, wiped the sweat from their skin, then went to tend the next patient, unwittingly passing the plague along. In crowded houses, where entire families shared a single bed, infection moved faster than fear itself. Within weeks, the village changed. Church bells tolled constantly, so often that the sound became meaningless. Graves filled before they were finished being dug. Priests began refusing to enter plague houses, terrified of joining their parishioners in death. Bodies were left in homes until the smell forced neighbors to drag them out with hooks. Carts rolled through the streets piled with corpses, bound together with rope. In some places, there were no carts left to use. Chronicles from the time read like nightmares. A mother abandoning her feverish child to save herself. A child waking to find both parents cold beside them. Entire villages silenced. Only the wind moving through empty fields where crops rotted unharvested. The survivors buried their dead in haste, then fled, leaving the sick behind to die alone. The cities fared even worse. Narrow alleys and packed tenements became perfect breeding grounds. People barricaded themselves indoors, only to find that death crept in anyway, through rats, through goods, through the smallest touch. In some towns, half the population vanished within months. In others, nearly everyone. Chroniclers wrote that grass grew over abandoned streets, that wolves roamed where children had once played. It wasn't just death that spread, it was madness. People turned on one another, searching for scapegoats, foreigners, beggars, the poor, even cats and dogs. Entire communities were destroyed not only by the disease, but by the fear it left in its wake. The plague's cruelty wasn't in its mystery alone, it was in its speed too. A healthy face in the morning could be cold by a night. The body blackened, swollen, and still before anyone could comprehend what was happening. Food rotted in markets because no one dared to buy it. Bells stopped ringing because there were no bell ringers left. Even the doctors, the few who dared to visit, wore strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, believing the scent might purify the air and keep them safe. Most died anyway, and yet the plague never truly left. It retreated, only to return years later, striking again and again like a memory that refused to fade. Each outbreak reopened the same terror. Every cough, every fever, every ache in the joints became a sign that death had come back. For those who survived, the world was forever changed. They carried invisible wounds, grief that had no language, fear that never slept. In the end, it wasn't just the bodies that perished, but the trust that bound communities together. Plague taught people that the line between life and death was no longer measured in years or decades, but in days, even hours. The infection from that paper cut you're ignoring. In the Dark Ages, it could have been the last thing you ever ignored. Death didn't always arrive with the drama of plague carts or church bells tolling for hundreds. Most of the time, it came quietly, through the smallest wounds, the simplest fevers, the accidents of ordinary living. A farmer nicked his hand on a sickle while harvesting grain. Within days, the skin around the cut turned red and swollen. The pain spread up his arm. His body burned with fever, and the wound began to ooze. No one understood infection, only that the flesh blackened and the smell turned foul. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, no clean bandages. The man might die within a week, delirious and shivering, the wound crawling with flies. A lifetime of labor ended by a scratch. Everyday life was filled with invisible dangers like that. A cough in winter could deepen into a chest infection that drowned the lungs in fluid. Children wheezed and gasped through the cold months, their breath becoming shallower until they stopped altogether. The elderly followed soon after. What we'd now call pneumonia or bronchitis was then simply the fever. And it took thousands each year. Water, essential yet deadly. Wells and streams teemed with bacteria no one could see or understand. A sip of contaminated water could bring violent diarrhea that emptied the body until nothing was left. People died of thirst while drinking all they could. Gastrointestinal disease was one of the great invisible killers, passing through villages with the seasons, leaving the weak and the young behind. Even teeth were lethal. A simple cavity could rot unchecked until the pain became unbearable. When infection reached the jaw or the bloodstream, it could swell the face grotesquely, make speaking impossible, and end in death by suffocation or sepsis. There were no dentists, only blacksmiths and barbers brave enough to pull teeth with iron tools, often worsening the wound. Skin infections too spread without mercy. A small blister could become an ulcer. A cut on the foot could turn gangrenous, the flesh dying inch by inch. Some lost limbs, others their lives. Ear infections that we treat with a short course of medicine today has often meant deafness, or, if the infection reached the brain, fatal convulsions. Appendicitis, gallstones, kidney infections, abscesses. Any one of them could erupt suddenly and end a life in agony. For women, childbirth was one of the most dangerous journeys they would ever take. Pregnancy meant continuing to labor in the fields or haul water while carrying another life inside them. There was no prenatal care, no doctors, no knowledge of nutrition or infection control. When the time came, birth happened at home, with help from family or local midwives who relied on experience, not science. Pain was endured without relief. If the baby was breech, if the bleeding didn't stop, if infection followed, the mother often died within days. 1 in 3 women might die this way, and those who survived often buried more children than they raised. Infant mortality was so common it reshaped emotion itself. Some parents waited months before naming a child, unwilling to risk the grief of loving someone who might not live through winter. Many families buried multiple infants before one reached adulthood. The churchyards were full of tiny graves, silent witnesses to a world where every birth carried the weight of possible death. The numbers tell a harsh truth. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 years, not because people aged faster, but because so many never reached adulthood. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or even 60s. But you would do so having buried siblings, friends, and likely your own children. Death was not a stranger. It was the most familiar presence in every home. To live in the medieval world was to coexist with it daily. Every meal, every breath, every touch of metal or water could carry the seeds of your undoing. And if disease did not take you, something else might soon enough. They didn't fear death in battle. They feared the years when the harvest failed, because then death would come slowly, painfully, gagging the weakest first while you watched and waited your turn. Famine was not an exception in the medieval world. It was a season that returned again and again, as familiar as winter. A summer of endless rain could drown the grain. A spring frost could kill the buds before they ever bore fruit. Armies passing through might trample fields, burn barns, or seize stores for themselves. Plague could steal the hands that tilled the soil. Livestock diseases could wipe out oxen and horses, leaving the land untilled and useless. And so, when the next harvest came, there was nothing. At first, hunger was only a visitor, a gnawing discomfort, an emptiness that could be endured. People tightened their belts, watered down their gruel, stretched flour with ground acorns or sawdust. They told themselves it was temporary. But as days passed, the ache deepened into a single consuming thought: food. Conversation dwindled to talk of it, who had some, where it might be found, what could be eaten that wasn't meant to be. The body responded first with protest, then with surrender. Fat melted away, leaving faces sharp and hollow, muscles wasted. The hands that once lifted tools now trembled under their own weight. Work became impossible, yet work was the only means of survival. Soon the hunger quieted, not because it was gone, but because the body had begun devouring itself. Fat turned to fuel, then muscle, then organs. People ate whatever they could find. Grass, leaves, bark stripped from trees. Leather boiled from belts or shoes, softened just enough to swallow. The seed grain meant for next year's planting disappeared, ensuring the next famine before this one had even ended. Cats, dogs, and rats vanished. Birds grew scarce. In some towns, there were whispers of worse things: graveyards disturbed, bones missing, the unthinkable done in desperation. Chroniclers wrote of people mixing clay with water to fill their bellies, only to die from the blockage it caused. The process of starvation was slow and merciless. After weeks without nourishment, thoughts dulled. People moved like ghosts, conserving energy for breathing. Hair fell out, teeth loosened, skin cracked and split. Swelling appeared in strange places, feet, legs, faces puffed and shiny. Starving bodies, paradoxically, began to look bloated. Minds slipped into fog, alternating between despair and detachment. Death often came not from hunger itself, but from infection, from drinking foul water from the cold. Families broke beneath the strain. Parents gave their share to children until they could no longer stand. The elderly, feeling their burden, refused to eat so that others might live another day. Theft became survival. Neighbors turned on one another for a crust of bread, a hidden jar of barley. Villagers fell silent, not from peace, but from exhaustion. When law and order vanished, hunger ruled. Merchants hoarded what little grain remained, guarded by men with weapons. Refugees wandered from town to town, too weak to beg, collapsing on the roadsides. Whole communities emptied. Those who survived did so with eyes haunted by what they'd done, or what they'd seen others do. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was only one of many. For 3 years, relentless rain ruined crops across Europe. Rivers overflowed, cattle drowned, and mold consumed stored grain. Millions died. Chroniclers described villages where the living were too weak to bury the dead, where dogs fed on human flesh. Yet even after the skies cleared, recovery was slow. The survivors had eaten the seed stock, killed the draft animals, stripped the forests bare. The soil itself seemed to have lost its will to live. To starve to death was to fade, not fall. You remained conscious long after your body began to vanish. You saw your family's faces sharpen into bone, heard the sound of your own stomach twisting in emptiness. And when death finally came, it was not a sudden mercy, but the quiet extinguishing of something already half gone. Those who endured famine never forgot it. They carried its ghost in their habits, hoarding crumbs, hiding grain, flinching at the sound of an empty pot. Generations later, the fear persisted, passed down like memory itself. The dread that abundance could vanish overnight, that hunger was never far away. Your Lord is at war. That doesn't mean soldiers are fighting somewhere else. It means soldiers are coming here, to your village, to take everything you have and burn what they can't carry. War in the Middle Ages wasn't distant or abstract. It didn't unfold on neat battlefields far from home. For the peasants who fed the armies, it arrived like a storm, sudden, overwhelming, and blind to sides. The quickest way to hurt an enemy was to destroy his land, and that land was you. The first warning was never the army itself, but the refugees, thin, staggering shapes on the road, clutching what little they could carry. Their stories sounded unbelievable. Villages razed, churches looted, fields on fire. But before long, the horizon filled with smoke, and disbelief turned to terror. When the soldiers arrived, they didn't come as protectors. They came hungry. War was fed by villages like yours, by the barns full of grain, by the livestock in the pastures, by whatever could be eaten, burned, or stolen. Soldiers were rarely paid enough to live. Living off the land wasn't a strategy, it was survival. They took what they wanted, because that was how war worked. The looting began immediately. Food, tools, cloth, coins, anything that could be carried was gone within hours. Chickens were snatched from yards, cattle driven away, smokehouses emptied. What couldn't be carried was destroyed to deny it to the enemy. Granaries burned, crops trampled, wells fouled. The soldiers laughed as they worked. because this was their right, the accepted wage of fighting. Peasants were not people to them, only resources. Then came worse, men were forced into labor, pressed into carrying supplies or digging defenses. Those who resisted were beaten or killed. Women were treated as spoils of war, their suffering dismissed as the ordinary cost of victory. Children hid in haylofts and forests, praying not to be noticed. Priests who protested were silenced. Their churches stripped of chalices and cloth, their altars overturned. Scorched earth was a strategy as much as cruelty. Burning everything ensured the enemy would starve when they arrived, but it also meant the villagers would starve too. The army would move on, leaving behind blackened earth and hollow-eyed survivors. Winter would finish what the soldiers began. Sometimes, two armies met near the same village. The peasants fled the first one, only to be plundered by the second. When the first returned in retreat, they looted again, claiming revenge for imagined betrayal. Each wave left less behind. No grain, no animals, no people strong enough to resist. A place that had been green and full of life became silent fields of ash. Chroniclers tell of horrors too numerous to count. Villages massacred as warnings. Families tortured to reveal where food was hidden. Children kidnapped and sold in distant markets. Refugees seeking shelter inside churches only to be burned alive when soldiers set the roofs aflame. The lines between war and banditry blurred. Men who had once been farmers became raiders themselves, desperate to survive by taking from others. When the armies moved on, they left more than ashes. They left the slow aftermath, years of rebuilding, if rebuilding was even possible. The fields had been scorched, the plough animals eaten, the seed grain taken or burned. Tools were gone. The men who could rebuild had been killed or conscripted. Women and children were left to pick through ruins, hoping to find enough unburned kernels to plant again. Hunger followed war like a shadow, and disease followed hunger. It could take decades for a region to recover. A single campaign might erase a generation's labor. Prosperous villages became wastelands, their names eventually forgotten. In some places, the forest reclaimed the land entirely, erasing the traces of human life, as if it had never been there. For peasants, their lord's wars were never victories. Whether he won or lost, they lost everything. Their loyalty brought them nothing but ashes and graves. That forest between your village and the next town, it wasn't just dark and scary. It was genuinely deadly, and bodies were found there regularly enough that everyone knew someone who disappeared on the road. Travel in the Middle Ages meant stepping into uncertainty. Beyond the safety of the village or the monastery's shadow, the world belonged to no one, or to anyone willing to claim it by force. The law stopped where the trees began. Outlaws were not the heroes of ballads. They were the casualties and predators of a hard world. Some were former soldiers, skilled with weapons, but abandoned when wars ended, their pay gone and their discipline fading with hunger. Others were peasants who'd lost everything, fields burned, families starved, turning to robbery because there was nothing left to lose. And some were simply men who discovered that killing was easier than working and safer than starving. The forests became their refuge. England's great woods, France's mountain passes, the dark stretches between German towns, all served as hiding places for men outside the reach of law. Travelers moved quickly and spoke little, clutching what they carried. The sound of hoofbeats behind you could mean company, or danger. Most peasants rarely left their villages at all. The next town might be 10 miles away, but the journey there meant crossing roads patrolled by no one, where travelers vanished without trace. Pilgrims, merchants, even messengers for the crown went armed or in groups when they could. The poor, traveling alone, walked with prayers on their lips. A bandit attack was swift and brutal. You might see them first as shapes emerging from the tree line, faces covered, weapons drawn. To resist was suicide. To submit was no guarantee of mercy. Coins, tools, clothing, everything of value was stripped away. Merchants were favorite targets, their wagons looted, their guards cut down. Women faced horrors too common to name. In the eyes of the attackers, they were spoils like any other. Afterward, survivors were left beaten or bleeding beside the road, if they were left alive at all. Some groups of outlaws were more organized than the armies they'd once served in. They established territories, demanded tolls from travelers, and executed anyone who refused. There were regions where local lords barely dared to ride without escort, where entire stretches of road became so dangerous they were avoided for generations. The difference between bandit and soldier was often one of uniform, not behavior. At night, fear crept closer to home. Villagers barred their doors with timber and iron, kept dogs awake, and slept with axes or sickles by their beds. A knock after dark could mean death. Bandits might raid isolated farms, taking grain, animals, or people. For many, the line between outlaw and ordinary man blurred. The starving might become the thieves they feared, stealing from neighbors just to survive. Justice, when it came, was rare and uneven. Local sheriffs might hang a captured thief as an example, leaving the body swinging at a crossroads. But for every outlaw caught, dozens vanished back into the woods. Even if victims survived to report the crime, pursuing the culprits was nearly impossible. They moved between territories, protected by distance and the indifference of those too frightened to interfere. Not all who lived as outlaws were truly criminals. Some were fugitives from oppression, escaped serfs seeking freedom, heretics fleeing religious persecution, rebels hiding from vengeance. The forest sheltered both the innocent and the guilty, but hunger made them indistinguishable in the dark. To the traveler, all shadows looked the same. For the medieval peasant, safety was local, bounded by faces you knew and roads you didn't take. Strangers were risks, travel was a gamble, and the wilderness was alive with human predators. Isolation wasn't just a matter of culture, it was survival. They didn't watch movies about violence. They watched actual violence in person regularly because not watching would itself be seen as suspicious. In the medieval world, justice was not private or discreet. It was spectacle. Punishment was meant to be seen, heard, and remembered. The goal wasn't just to punish the guilty, it was to remind everyone else who held the power to destroy. Every execution was a performance, and the audience was the entire community. When a condemned person was led through the streets, bells might ring to announce it. People gathered early to secure good spots, children perched on shoulders, vendors selling bread and ale. It was part of life, part of order. The authorities wanted eyes on the condemned, wanted people to watch the agony unfold. Seeing justice done was supposed to purify the town. In reality, it made violence a kind of public ritual. The methods were varied, but always deliberate. Hanging was common and rarely quick. The rope tightened slowly, crushing the windpipe while the body jerked and twisted for long minutes before stilling. Burning alive was reserved for heretics, witches, and traitors. The fire built carefully, the kindling arranged to ensure the condemned burned slowly, not in an instant. Beheading was considered merciful, but the executioner's skill determined how merciful it really was. A dull blade or nervous hand could mean several strokes before the head finally fell. Other punishments were worse. The breaking wheel turned the human body into a demonstration of suffering. Limbs shattered one by one with iron bars, bones cracking audibly, before the victim was left tied to the wheel until death finally came. The punishment of drawing and quartering began with a hanging just short of death, then disembowelment, mutilation, and dismemberment, each stage carried out before a crowd. Every moment was designed to teach the same lesson: defy authority, and this is your fate. The crowd didn't turn away. Attendance was expected. For many, it was the only public entertainment they ever saw. Market days and executions often shared the same schedule. People cheered or prayed or stood in silence as bodies burned or swung, and when it was over, they went home to supper. To refuse to attend, to seem unmoved, was to risk being seen as sympathetic to the condemned. Fear kept everyone watching. Torture, too, was official business. It wasn't hidden. It was part of the machinery of truth and power. Interrogations took place in chambers where the rack stretched limbs until joints tore. Thumbscrews crushed bones. The boot splintered legs. The strappado hoisted prisoners by the arms, tied behind their backs, until shoulders dislocated. Water torture drowned and revived its victims again and again. These acts were recorded, witnessed, and justified as lawful means of extracting confession or punishment. No one was exempt. Criminals, heretics, rebels, and the unlucky all faced the same instruments. Women accused of witchcraft, men suspected of heresy. Even travelers with the wrong accent could find themselves before the torturer's bench. Pain was the language of authority, and silence under pain was interpreted as guilt. Children grew up in this theatre of cruelty. They walked past gibbets where bodies hung for weeks, rotting as warnings. Heads on spikes decorated city gates. In smaller towns, gallows stood at the crossroads, constant reminders that death waited for those who strayed. What would traumatize modern eyes was for them ordinary. It shaped how they understood life. Power was physical, justice was violent, and mercy was rare. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a system. The spectacle of suffering reinforced obedience. The church sanctified it as divine justice. The state used it to maintain control. Watching others die painfully wasn't meant to harden hearts, but it inevitably did. When violence is daily, empathy becomes dangerous. The medieval world taught its people that order came through fear. Every scream, every execution, every body left for display whispered the same warning: obey, conform, stay silent, or this could be you. When your mind breaks from too much suffering, there's no therapy, no medication, no understanding. There's only the fear that you're being punished by God or possessed by demons. And both explanations end badly. In the medieval world, the mind was not seen as a separate realm to be healed. It was the battleground of the soul, where sin and salvation struggled for control. Every thought, every mood, every fear was part of a divine story. When someone's thoughts darkened, when their emotions turned inward, or their behavior became strange, people didn't see illness. They saw spiritual danger. A person crushed by despair was said to be suffering from melancholy, one of the four humors that governed the body. Physicians spoke of black bile, an excess that darkened the spirit. Priests, meanwhile, spoke of sin, of doubt, of a heart straying from God's light. To be sad for too long was to risk damnation. Prayers were prescribed more often than remedies. Anxiety, the constant unease that gnawed at so many living on the edge of hunger and death, wasn't seen as natural either. It was weakness of faith, a failure to trust in divine providence. The cure was confession, penance, fasting. Acts meant to purify the soul, though they often weakened the body further. The worried were told to surrender to God. Those who couldn't were simply left to suffer. Hallucinations and delusions were far more dangerous. Hearing voices might make you a saint or a witch, depending on what those voices said and who was listening. Some claimed visions of angels and were revered as holy mystics. Others, especially women, were accused of consorting with devils. Madness could be mistaken for prophecy, but prophecy could, just as easily, be redefined as madness. One day, you were a vessel of divine truth. The next, you were chained in a cell awaiting exorcism. The treatments for those thought to be possessed were brutal. Demons, it was believed, could be beaten out, starved out, smoked out. The afflicted might be kept bound for months, denied food or sleep. Their bodies marked by blows meant for the invisible spirit inside them. Some were forced to swallow foul substances said to cleanse the soul. Others were locked in church crypts or dark rooms for years, forgotten by all but their families and the priest who occasionally checked if the demons still lived. In smaller villages, the mildly afflicted were sometimes tolerated. The simple one, who muttered to himself, the woman who wandered and wept, the child who didn't speak. They were pitied or mocked, but allowed to exist at the edges of the community. People might whisper that such souls were touched, caught between worlds. But if their behavior turned violent, or their words sounded blasphemous, patience vanished. There was no hospital to take them to, no doctor who understood. Only chains, prayer, or the fire. Every modern condition existed then. Depression, anxiety, trauma, psychosis, but with no language to name them. The soldier returning from war who woke screaming at night was said to be haunted by spirits. The widow who couldn't stop weeping months after her loss was accused of refusing to accept God's will. The child who stared blankly into space after famine or plague had taken their family was thought to be bewitched. What we'd now call trauma was seen as a moral failing, not a wound. And yet, beneath the superstition, there was a quiet recognition of human fragility. Medieval people understood suffering. Everyone bore it, even if they couldn't explain it. They lived in a world where grief and fear never ended, where sanity was less a state and more a temporary gift. For those who broke under the weight of that reality, compassion was fleeting, and understanding non-existent. Some found strange refuge in their own madness. A woman who claimed to see visions might gain food and shelter as a holy recluse. A man who wandered speaking to unseen angels might be tolerated as a fool of God. But this mercy was precarious. One accusation, one skeptical priest, one shift in the wind of belief, and sanctity became heresy. To live, then, was to balance on the edge of your own mind, praying it would hold. Because if it faltered, there was no help waiting, only fear, suspicion, and pain. When everyone's suffering and no one knows why, the community doesn't seek complex explanations. They seek someone to burn. In the medieval world, misfortune was constant, but it was rarely seen as random. If crops failed, if children died, if plague swept through again, there had to be a cause. People needed to believe that suffering meant something, that it came from somewhere, and, most importantly, that it could be stopped. In a world without science, the line between natural and supernatural blurred until fear filled every gap. When a bad harvest struck, it began quietly. Murmurs at the well, sideways glances toward the woman who always muttered to herself, the one who'd quarreled with her neighbor last spring. When a cow stopped giving milk, or a child grew ill without explanation, the questions sharpened. Who had angered God? Who had invited evil? The search for sin quickly became a search for someone. The first to be accused were often those already on the margins. An old widow living alone, her hands stained by years of herb work. A man with a crooked spine who frightened children. A woman who helped deliver babies, but whose own children had all died. Anyone strange, solitary, or unlucky could become the vessel for a village's fear. Even a bad look at the wrong time could mark you as dangerous. Once suspicion began, it rarely stopped. The whispers became evidence. A neighbor who'd lost livestock might recall seeing the accused walking by that very morning. Someone remembered hearing her laugh when the rain didn't come. Another swore they'd seen a strange light in her window. Fear wove these fragments into a story, and stories became truth. When officials were called, the process took on its own ritual cruelty. Tests were devised to let God reveal the truth. The accused might be tied and thrown into water. If she floated, she was guilty of rejecting the purity of God's element. If she sank, she was innocent but drowned. Others were forced to touch red-hot irons or walk barefoot across coals. Survive, and you were a witch. Perish, and you were pure. Either way, the village was satisfied. Torture followed confession. Under the rack, under the boot, people said what was demanded. They confessed to flying on broomsticks, to dancing with demons, to blighting fields and poisoning wells. Pain made liars of them all. But each confession required accomplices, and each name spoken meant another arrest. Fear spread like a second plague. Neighbor accusing neighbor. Families torn apart. Entire communities consuming themselves in fire and rope. Witch hunts were not rare, isolated frenzies. They were woven into the rhythm of medieval life. A run of bad luck could trigger one anywhere. In some towns, dozens or even hundreds died in a single season. The pattern was always the same: disaster, fear, accusation, execution, and silence. Until the next disaster began it anew. And witches weren't the only scapegoats. Jews, forced by law into money-lending and trade, were accused of poisoning wells during the plague, of spreading disease intentionally, of murdering Christian children in secret rituals. Pogroms erupted with terrifying speed. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out overnight, their homes looted, their synagogues burned. The violence was not spontaneous, it was cathartic, a way for the broken to punish someone tangible. The same wounds that created faith also created fury. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had learned a grim habit. When pain arrived, blame followed. Communities turned inward, watching one another with suspicion. People learned to hide their differences, their doubts, their oddities. To stand out was to risk destruction. Survival depended on silence, conformity, and the careful avoidance of notice. In this atmosphere, fear itself became a kind of order. As long as there was someone to accuse, the rest could feel momentarily safe. The fire burned away uncertainty until the next misfortune, the next whisper, the next name. You can't check tomorrow's weather, your health status, your bank account, or your safety alerts. You can only wake up, work hard, pray constantly, and hope you're still alive when the sun sets. That was the reality of medieval life, a daily existence built on uncertainty so profound that even the simplest act, like planting seeds or traveling to market, carried the quiet possibility of disaster. Every person lived at the mercy of forces they couldn't predict or control. A season of rain too long or too short could destroy the harvest. A fever could sweep through a home and take half the family within days. War might arrive without warning, announced only by the smoke rising from the next village. Even justice was unpredictable, depending less on truth than on who held power that week. In such a world, control became a dream people learned to live without. Instead, they sought patterns, signs, omens, rituals to make sense of the chaos. A red dawn could foretell misfortune. A sudden stillness in the wind might mean divine warning. Shoes on a table invited death. A cat crossing the threshold signaled danger. Breads left for household spirits could keep mischief at bay. Before planting, farmers murmured prayers or traced crosses in the soil, asking both God and the unseen forces of nature for mercy. These acts were not superstition in the shallow sense. They were small assertions of hope, a way to feel that effort still mattered, even when the universe seemed indifferent. The medieval mind leaned heavily on the idea of fate. Life was imagined as a great wheel, the wheel of fortune, spinning endlessly, lifting some up, crushing others down. No one knew when their turn would come, or why. The righteous might suffer while the wicked prospered, and this wasn't contradiction. It was simply how the world worked. Fortune was blind, and her wheel turned without reason or mercy. This belief was frightening, but it also brought a strange comfort. If suffering was random, it wasn't personal. If disaster struck, it wasn't always your fault. Faith filled the spaces that reason could not. God's will became the framework for everything, both hope and explanation. People prayed not just for salvation, but for stability, for the illusion that their actions could influence outcomes. Pilgrimages were taken for health, relics touched for luck, candles lit to ward off disease. Life was a constant negotiation between faith and fear. When control was impossible, meaning was the only defense against despair. That uncertainty shaped more than belief. It shaped ambition. Why risk innovation when the future was so fragile? Why plan too far ahead when plague or famine might erase every plan? Stability became the greatest virtue. People clung to the old ways because they were proof of the survival. The past offered a kind of safety. If it had worked before, perhaps it would again. The idea of progress as we understand it now was alien. The goal was endurance, not change. Yet beneath that fatalism lay deep resilience. Communities leaned on one another, not from sentiment but necessity. Shared labor, shared grief, shared prayer, all were survival strategies. When control over the world vanished, control over one's spirit became sacred. To endure with faith was the only victory possible. Modern life hides how fragile we still are. We can predict the weather, prevent infection, insure our homes, and store food for years. We believe in plans, schedules, control. But for most of history, those things were impossible dreams. Medieval people lived in constant negotiation with uncertainty, their minds shaped by the knowledge that life could change or end before sunset. And yet, they survived. They built villages and cathedrals, raised children, created art, told stories. Out of chaos, they made continuity. Out of fear, they made faith. They survived not because they were stronger or braver than you. They survived because humans are stubborn creatures who keep living even when every rational reason suggests they shouldn't. After everything we've seen, the hunger, the filth, the parasites, the endless labor, the wars and plagues and grief, one question lingers like smoke after a fire. How did they keep going? How did millions of people wake each morning to lives that offered so little comfort and so much pain and still choose to carry on? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't romantic. It begins with something deep and wordless, the sheer instinct to live. When every day demands all your strength, survival becomes its own purpose. The body resists death even when the mind is exhausted. You breathe because you can. You move because stopping would mean freezing, starving, or being forgotten. In the medieval world, there was no luxury of asking whether life was fair. Only the constant, practical effort to keep it going. But instinct alone doesn't explain endurance. Humans aren't built just to exist. We need meaning. For medieval people, that meaning came from faith, from duty, from one another. Religion offered a framework that made suffering bearable. Pain had purpose. Hardship could purify the soul. Endurance could earn eternal peace. Even when God felt distant, the church's rituals, bells and prayers reminded people that life fit into something larger. Every death, every loss, every failure had its place in a divine pattern too vast to see. Community held them together where faith might falter. The same neighbors who borrowed your tools today might help rebuild your house tomorrow. In a world where isolation meant death, cooperation was survival. After plague, survivors buried the dead and replanted the fields. After armies passed through, families gathered to salvage seed grain from ashes. Villages that had lost half their people still found ways to sing at festivals the next year, because silence was unbearable. Adaptation also played its part. What seems unimaginable to us became normal when it had to be. The smell of rot, the itch of lice, the ache of constant work, all faded into the background of existence. Humans learn to endure by shrinking what they feel, by turning agony into routine. Even despair can become familiar. When tragedy is constant, grief becomes a language everyone speaks quietly but understands completely. And yet, amid that endless struggle, there were moments of light. A farmer might feel satisfaction in a field finally ploughed. A mother might find joy in a child's laughter after illness. A stonemason might take pride in shaping a perfect arch that would outlive him. Music filled taverns. Feasts marked the turning of seasons. Lovers found each other even in plague years. The small pleasures, the scent of bread, the warmth of a fire, the first green shoots after winter, mattered all the more because they were fragile. Records from the time show this strange resilience again and again. After the Black Death, towns repopulated, markets reopened, and cathedrals resumed construction. After invasions, burned villages rebuilt from rubble, one timber at a time. There are accounts of parents losing every child to illness, yet still caring for orphaned neighbors. Soldiers returned from war missing limbs and still took up work in fields. People who had every reason to surrender simply didn't. They weren't unbreakable. Many did break, gave up, despaired, disappeared into the silence of history. But enough endured that the thread of human life never snapped. Knowledge survived in monasteries, songs passed through generations, stories whispered beside fires. Civilization didn't triumph, it persisted. Sometimes that's the greater miracle. Perhaps that's what we can learn from them. Not admiration, but perspective. Comfort dulls our sense of what we're capable of. They lived in a world that tested every limit of endurance. And yet we are here because they didn't quit. Their resilience wasn't noble suffering. It was simple defiance of extinction. They lived. They rebuilt. They hoped again. And through their survival, they gave us the world we call ordinary. They built cathedrals that took 200 years to complete. They would never see them finished. They built them anyway. That's not faith. That's defiance. Out of the same hands that shoveled mud, harvested grain, and buried the dead came some of the most astonishing creations in human history. The medieval world, brutal and uncertain as it was, produced beauty meant to outlast the flesh that made it. Cathedrals rose from villages of timber huts, each one a monument to both belief and endurance. Every stone lifted was an act of hope in a world that promised no guarantees. Those cathedrals were miracles of design. Their architects, many anonymous, some half-educated, found ways to turn stone into light. Flying buttresses supported walls high enough to make heaven seem almost reachable. Arches stretched upward like prayers frozen in shape. Colored glass transformed sunlight into sermons, teaching the illiterate through color and story. The very air inside those buildings was engineered to carry the echo of chant, to make sound feel sacred. They weren't just places of worship. They were lessons in geometry, acoustics, and vision centuries ahead of their time. And they were built not by specialists, but by communities. Peasants worked part-time on construction, between ploughing and harvest. Masons, carpenters, and apprentices labored without safety gear, perched on wooden scaffolds hundreds of feet high. Falls were common, injuries constant. Tools were simple: hammers, chisels, ropes. But the precision they achieved rivals anything modern machinery could do. The builders were rarely paid well, and none would live to see the final stones laid.
Yet generation after generation continued, because to build something eternal in a fleeting world was its own kind of salvation. The same spirit appeared in quieter places. In monasteries where the air smelled of wax and vellum, monks copied books by candlelight. They preserved the words of Greece and Rome, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, that might have vanished forever. Each letter took time, each mistake meant starting again. Some manuscripts gleamed with gold leaf, pages illuminated with patterns so fine they seem impossible even now. These scribes worked not for recognition, but for the idea that knowledge itself was sacred. Outside the cloisters, other innovations reshaped daily survival. Farmers developed the heavy plow that cut deep into northern soil, and the three-field system that rotated crops to preserve fertility.
These inventions slowly turned famine into plenty. Universities formed around cathedral schools, gathering minds who dared to ask questions about nature, logic, and law. In workshops, artisans experimented with gears and weights, creating the first mechanical clocks, devices that made time measurable, no longer just a rhythm of sunrise and prayer. Even in art and song, they reached towards something larger. Weavers spent years on a single tapestry that told entire histories in thread. Musicians composed harmonies that still resonate across centuries. Storytellers recited poems of knights and saints, not to escape hardship, but to make sense of it. Every creative act was rebellion against decay, the insistence that the mind could still shape beauty in a world ruled by death. They were not primitives, they were practical geniuses working within the narrow boundaries of survival. Their technology was limited, their science young, but their imagination was vast. The systems they built, laws, guilds, universities, cathedrals, became the scaffolding for the modern world. Their plows fed future cities, their schools birthed reason, their architecture defined ambition itself. Much was lost along the way. Fires consumed libraries, invaders razed towns. Knowledge vanished when those who held it died too soon. But enough remained, enough survived for light to cross the centuries, for one age to hand its flame to the next. They lived short, difficult lives, but what they left behind refused to die. Their cathedrals still rise against the sky. Their songs still echo in stone. Their words still shape the way we think. Out of darkness, they built continuity. You are the answer to their suffering. Every medieval person who survived one more day, endured one more winter, outlived one more plague, they are why you exist. Their resilience is literally in your DNA. The distance between their world and ours feels immeasurable. We live surrounded by light, warmth, medicine, and safety they couldn't imagine. We have antibiotics for fevers that once killed in days, forecasts for storms that once destroyed entire harvests, laws to protect us from the chaos they called normal life. And yet, in the quiet hours of night, when anxiety returns and meaning feels fragile, we face our own forms of uncertainty. Ours are not the plagues and famines of the past. They're internal, existential. The mind becomes the battlefield that the medieval body once was. Perhaps that's why looking back matters to me. The medieval world holds up a mirror, showing us both how far we've come and how human we still are. Their pain gives us perspective. Our worst days, the frustration, the fear, the loneliness, are lived in comfort beyond their best dreams. That doesn't make modern suffering meaningless, but it reminds us of scale. The aches of the spirit are different from the hunger of the body. Seeing what they endured doesn't invalidate our pain, it grounds it. Gratitude follows naturally from that perspective. Every life today is built on the shoulders of people who had no reason to believe the future would exist. They sowed seeds they would never see grow. They rebuilt after every ruin, not knowing that centuries later, their persistence would create us. To recognize that is to feel a kind of quiet reverence for survival itself. Every comfort we have, every clean glass of water, every safe night's sleep, is the outcome of generations refusing to vanish. Their endurance also reveals something about our own potential. Humans are capable of more resilience than comfort allows us to remember. We are built from survivors, the ones who didn't give up, who adapted to cold, hunger, and fear. Their persistence is not a story in a book. It's an inheritance written into our cells. When life feels unbearable, that same instinct whispers beneath the noise of modern despair. Keep going. It's what you were made to do. There's another lesson too, one about community. Medieval survival depended on neighbors, not institutions. No one survived alone. Families, villages, guilds, churches, each formed a web of interdependence strong enough to hold against catastrophe. In our world of screens and self-sufficiency, we often forget that connection is also a survival mechanism. The same species that endured the dark ages by sharing food and labor now struggles against isolation. Their closeness, born from necessity, was its own kind of strength. Meaning, too, came differently to them. They didn't expect happiness as a constant. They expected struggle and sought meaning within it. Faith, duty, family, the continuation of life itself. In a paradoxical way, the absence of comfort made purpose easier to find. When survival is uncertain, every act of care, work, or creation becomes sacred. Perhaps abundance makes meaning harder for us, because we can live without asking what we're living for. It's important not to romanticize their pain. Suffering doesn't make people noble. It only reveals what endurance can do. But understanding the medieval world isn't about pitying them or idealizing them. It's about recognizing the full spectrum of what being human has meant. They felt fear, hope, love, and grief just as we do. The difference is only circumstance, not heart. When you imagine them now, the builders of cathedrals they'd never see finished, the mothers who buried children yet kept living, the monks copying words in freezing scriptoria, remember that their story doesn't end in the past. It continues through you. Their survival shaped yours. Their strength carried forward through centuries of birth, death, and persistence until it became your own. One day, future generations will look back at us with the same mixture of awe and pity. They'll see our triumphs and blind spots, our comforts and our hidden suffering. And just like those who came before, we will have done our best to endure, to create, to pass something forward. In that sense, history is not distant. It's alive, looking back through time's mirror, reminding us that the will to endure has never belonged to one era. It belongs to humanity itself.